August 3, 1943. Camp Shelby, Mississippi. The humid air clings to everything like a second skin as Oberfeldwebel Friedrich Weber stands in the mess hall line, his stomach churning with equal parts hunger and dread. Through the serving window, he watches American cooks preparing the evening meal, steam rising from massive steel pots. The aroma is unfamiliar, sweet and earthy at once, nothing like the cabbage soup and black bread he'd grown accustomed to in the Wehrmacht. 3 months have passed since his capture at Carson Pass, 3 months since the transport ship crossed an ocean he never imagined seeing, 3 months since he prepared himself for the brutal end promised by every propaganda broadcast he'd absorbed during his 6 years of service. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. But death never came. Neither did the torture chambers, the starvation cells, or the mass graves that Reichsminister Goebbels had described in such vivid detail during those crackling radio addresses in the barracks outside Benghazi. What came instead was this strange limbo of comfort and confusion, where the enemy fed you 3 times daily and asked politely if you needed medical attention. Weber inches forward in line, his boots scraping against the wooden floor. The American soldier ahead of him, a guard named something like Carson or Carlson, accepts his tray with the casual ease of a man retrieving his mail. No trembling hands, no fearful glances at the German prisoners surrounding him. The guard even nods a thank you to the cook, as if kindness to the help was simply expected behavior rather than a sign of dangerous weakness. When Weber reaches the serving station, a large black cook with forearms like tree trunks smiles at him. The smile alone nearly makes Weber step backward. In all his training, in every briefing about American military culture, no one had mentioned that the Americans allowed Africans to serve alongside whites, much less handle the food preparation for white prisoners. The cognitive framework Weber had carried across the Atlantic simply had no category for this reality. The cook says something in English, his tone friendly and expectant. Weber understands perhaps 1 word in 5, enough to know it's a question but not enough to formulate a response. He simply holds out his metal tray, prepared for whatever gruel or scraps the Americans deemed sufficient for enemy combatants. What lands on his tray makes Weber's breath catch in his throat. A thick slice of meat, glistening with some kind of glaze. A mound of mashed potatoes with a pat of real butter melting into a small crater at the summit. Green beans that look freshly picked rather than canned into gray submission. And then, occupying nearly a quarter of the tray, something Weber has never seen before in his 28 years of life. A golden cylinder, perhaps 20 centimeters long, studded with hundreds of small kernels arranged in perfect geometric rows. Steam rises from its surface, and even from this distance, Weber can smell something sweet and strangely appetizing. The cook says another English phrase and makes a turning motion with his hands, demonstrating something. But Weber is too stunned by the sheer abundance of food to process the instruction. He carries his tray to the long wooden tables where other German prisoners sit in various stages of shock and adaptation. Some men, those who arrived months earlier from the North Africa campaign, eat with the mechanical efficiency of soldiers who've stopped questioning their good fortune. Others, fresh arrivals from the Tunisia defeat like Weber himself, stare at their meals as if searching for hidden poison or elaborate traps. Weber sits beside Gefreiter Otto Kellerman, a radio operator from Hamburg who'd been captured in the same engagement. Kellerman is examining the golden cylinder on his tray with scientific curiosity, turning it with his fork like a biologist studying an unusual specimen. "It's corn," says a voice from across the table. The speaker is Hauptmann Dieter Vogel, a Luftwaffe pilot whose plane went down over Algeria 6 months earlier. Vogel has acquired a thin coating of American mannerisms in his time here, a slight looseness in his posture that would have earned him reprimands in any proper Wehrmacht unit. Maize, technically. They eat it directly off something called a cob. Weber stares at him. Off the cob? Like animals? Vogel shrugs, already sawing into his meat with evident satisfaction. The Americans are peculiar about many things. Wait until you see them put cheese on everything, or their obsession with something called ice cream in the middle of summer. Kellerman picks up the corn cob with both hands, examining it from multiple angles. How does one consume this exactly? You hold it at both ends, Vogel explains, demonstrating with his own cob, and you bite the kernels directly off the surface. Try to go in rows to be efficient about it. Weber watches Vogel bite into his corn with evident pleasure, the kernels popping between his teeth, butter glistening on his lips. The sight triggers a cascade of conflicting thoughts. This is how peasants eat, grabbing food with their hands like children. This is barbaric, uncivilized, proof of everything the Reich said about American cultural inferiority. But the aroma keeps reaching him, sweet and inviting. His stomach, which has known true hunger during the long retreat across Tunisia, doesn't care about cultural superiority theories. His stomach wants food, and this golden cylinder represents more calories than he sometimes saw in 2 days of Wehrmacht rations during the worst of the campaign. Weber picks up the corn cob. It's warm in his hands, almost hot, the butter making his fingers slippery. He brings it close to his face, inhaling the sweet steam. Around him, other prisoners are attempting their first bites, some successful, others comically ineffective as they try to figure out the proper angle of attack. He takes his first bite. The kernels burst in his mouth with a sweetness he didn't expect, nothing like the dry field corn he'd seen in German agricultural regions. The texture is tender but with enough resistance to provide satisfaction. The butter adds richness, and underneath it all is an earthy sweetness that seems to contain the essence of summer itself. Weber takes another bite, then another, finding a rhythm. The juice runs down his chin, making him feel like an uncivilized child, but he cannot stop. Each row of kernels disappears with increasing efficiency as he develops technique. When he reaches the end of the cob, he realizes he's holding nothing but a bare core, every kernel consumed. He looks up to find Kellerman watching him with wide eyes. Is it good? Weber nods slowly, unable to articulate what he's just experienced. It wasn't just the food, though the food itself was remarkable. It was the casualness of abundance, the way the Americans served this strange vegetable as if it were the most ordinary thing in the world. No rationing cards, no careful measuring of portions, no speeches about sacrifice for the war effort. Just food, prepared well, served generously, offered to prisoners of war as if they were guests rather than captured enemies. They eat this regularly, Vogel says, wiping butter from his own chin with a cloth napkin that had been provided. Not just in camps, but in their homes. They have so much corn that they feed it to their animals, make oil from it, even turn it into syrup. The abundance here is difficult to comprehend. Weber looks down at his empty cob, then at the rest of his tray. The meat is excellent, the potatoes are creamy, the green beans are seasoned with something that might be bacon. This single meal contains more protein and vegetables than he typically saw in 3 days of Wehrmacht rations during active combat operations. The propaganda had been specific and terrifying. Goebbels himself had described American prison camps as death factories where captured Germans were worked to exhaustion, beaten for entertainment, and fed just enough to prolong their suffering. Training officers had shown photographs, allegedly smuggled from prisoner camps, showing emaciated men in rags, bodies stacked like cordwood, guards with vicious dogs and electric prods. Weber had memorized the horror stories, preparing himself mentally for torture, degradation, and probable death. His last night before capture, huddled in a collapsed supply depot while American artillery pounded their positions, he and Kellerman had made a pact. They would resist to the end. They would reveal nothing under interrogation. They would maintain their dignity even as the Americans demonstrated their barbaric nature. The reality that greeted them at Camp Shelby destroyed those expectations within 24 hours of arrival. The processing began with medical examinations conducted by actual doctors who seemed genuinely concerned about the infected wounds Weber had sustained during capture. They cleaned his injuries, administered sulfa drugs, and gave him pain medication without asking a single question about troop movements or tactical information. The barracks assigned to new arrivals featured real beds with mattresses, not the straw-filled sacks they'd slept on during training. Electric lights provided illumination after sunset. Running water, both hot and cold, was available in communal washrooms that were cleaned daily by rotating work details. The German prisoners were even issued fresh uniforms, American-made but dyed to approximate Wehrmacht colors, since their original clothing had been reduced to rags during the North Africa campaign. Most shocking of all was the absolute absence of brutality. No beatings, no intimidation, no calculated cruelty designed to break the spirit. American guards were polite, often friendly, and seemed to operate under strict orders to treat prisoners in accordance with some international agreement Weber had heard mentioned but never fully understood. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Richardson, Camp Shelby's prisoner affairs officer, had addressed the newly arrived Germans through an interpreter. Richardson spoke no German himself, but the interpreter, a thin scholarly man named Professor Adler who'd taught at Heidelberg before emigrating in 1938, translated with precision. "Gentlemen, you are prisoners of war of the United States Army. As such, you will be treated according to the Geneva Convention of 1929, which both Germany and the United States have ratified. You will receive medical care equal to that provided to our own soldiers. You will be fed adequately. You will be housed safely. You will be permitted to write to your families. You will have access to recreational facilities and educational materials. Any American personnel who violate these standards will face court-martial. Do you have questions?" The German prisoners had sat in stunned silence. Weber remembered looking around at his fellow captives, seeing his own confusion reflected in their faces. This was supposed to be a trap, an elaborate psychological operation designed to lower their guard before the real horrors began. No army treats its enemies with genuine kindness. No nation feeds its prisoners better than it feeds its own citizens during wartime rationing. But weeks passed, then months, and the trap never sprung. The food kept coming, 3 meals a day, every day, with quantities and quality that exceeded anything Weber had experienced even during peacetime in Germany. The medical care continued, treating everything from minor infections to serious injuries with the same competence and concern. The recreational facilities expanded as more prisoners arrived, with the Americans seemingly determined to keep German morale high through organized activities. Weber finishes the last of his mashed potatoes and stands to return his tray. The dining hall is enormous, capable of seating 400 men simultaneously. Every table is full, every seat occupied by a German prisoner eating American food served by American cooks under American supervision. The noise level is remarkable, hundreds of conversations in German creating a din that reminds Weber of civilian restaurants in Berlin before the war. He deposits his tray at the collection station, where another American soldier, this one young enough to be in high school, accepts it with a nodded thanks. Weber walks out into the Mississippi evening, the heat barely diminished by sunset, humidity pressing down like a physical weight. The camp compound stretches across what must be several hundred acres, all of it enclosed by double chain-link fencing topped with barbed wire and illuminated by electric lights spaced every 30 meters. Guard towers stand at each corner, manned by American soldiers with rifles, but Weber has never seen them pointed at prisoners except during the formal inspections required by military protocol. Beyond the fences, visible in the fading light, lies America itself. Farmland mostly, cotton fields and soybean crops tended by civilian workers who sometimes wave at the German prisoners during work details. The civilians show no fear, no hatred, just curiosity about these foreign soldiers who've somehow ended up in rural Mississippi. Weber finds himself walking toward the recreation yard, where evening activities are already underway. A soccer match occupies one field, Bavarians versus Prussians if the shouted insults are any indication. Another group practices calisthenics under the supervision of a former physical education instructor who's appointed himself unofficial athletics coordinator. But Weber's attention is drawn to a different scene. Near the western fence, a group of perhaps 20 German prisoners stands in a rough semicircle, watching something beyond the wire with intense focus. Weber approaches, recognizing several men from his transport ship. Through the fence, on American soil but still visible in the camp lights, several guards have gathered for what appears to be some kind of recreational activity. They've marked out a diamond pattern in the dirt with 4 white squares at the corners. One guard stands at the center holding what looks like a small white ball, while another crouches behind a fifth man who holds a wooden club in a strange batting stance. "They play this every evening," says a voice beside Weber. He turns to find Feldwebel Heinrich Strasser, an infantry veteran from the Eastern Front who'd been transferred to Africa and captured during the same retreat. The Americans call it baseball. It makes no sense whatsoever, but they take it very seriously. Weber watches as the guard with the ball throws it with considerable force toward the man with the club. The batter swings, connects with a sharp crack that echoes across the compound, and the ball sails high into the darkening sky. The batter drops his club and begins running around the white squares in a counterclockwise pattern while other guards scramble to catch the falling ball. "What is the objective?" Weber asks. Strasser shrugs. "Near as I can tell, you try to hit the ball and run around the squares before they can retrieve it and touch you with it. Points are scored somehow. They keep elaborate statistics on everything. It seems to be very important to them culturally." The Americans continue their game with obvious joy, shouting encouragement to teammates, groaning at mistakes, celebrating successful plays with enthusiasm that seems almost childlike. These are soldiers, Weber reminds himself. Men trained for war, some of whom have likely killed Germans in combat. Yet here they are, playing a game with the intensity of children on a school playground. "Tomorrow they're going to ask if any of us want to learn," Strasser continues. "The recreation officer announced it this morning. They want to teach prisoners how to play their game." Weber turns to look at him. "Will you volunteer?" Strasser is quiet for a moment, watching the Americans play. "I keep thinking about the things we were told. About how Americans are culturally inferior, obsessed with entertainment and pleasure, weak in spirit and body. But then I watch them throw that ball and I see the strength required. I watch them run and I see genuine athletic ability. I watch them keep their statistics and I see minds that understand mathematics and strategy." He pauses, then adds quietly, "I'm beginning to think we were lied to about many things." Weber doesn't respond, but the same thought has been growing in his own mind since that first bite of corn on the cob. If the Americans are so barbaric, why do they feed their prisoners fresh vegetables and real meat? If they are so culturally inferior, why do their guards laugh and play games instead of drinking themselves into angry stupors like so many Wehrmacht officers he'd known? If they are so weak, how did they cross an ocean to defeat the vaunted Afrika Korps in its own territory? The questions pile up like sandbags against a flood, each one threatening to breach the ideological walls Weber has spent years constructing. He joined the Wehrmacht at 22, seduced by promises of glory and convinced of German superiority in all things. He marched across Poland, France, and into Africa believing he represented the pinnacle of human civilization, bringing order to lesser peoples. But now he stands behind chain-link fence in Mississippi, watching American guards play a child's game while his belly is full of corn on the cob and real meat, and nothing makes sense anymore. The baseball game concludes as darkness settles completely. The American guards collect their equipment and walk back toward their own barracks, still laughing and recounting highlights from the game. One of them notices the watching German prisoners and waves casually, as if they were neighbors rather than enemies. Several of the Germans wave back hesitantly, the gesture so natural that Weber suspects they've done it before. That familiarity has already begun eroding the formal distance between captor and captive. Weber returns to his barracks, a long wooden structure that houses 60 men in rows of metal cots. The electricity is still on, allowing prisoners to read, write letters, or simply talk until the 10 o'clock curfew. Some men are already asleep, exhausted from work details in the nearby cotton fields where they've been assigned to help address American agricultural labor shortages. The work itself had been another shock. Weber expected brutal labor, pointless tasks designed to break the spirit through exhaustion. Instead, he found himself harvesting actual crops under reasonable conditions, working 8-hour days with regular breaks, paid in camp scrip that could be used at the canteen to purchase cigarettes, toiletries, and even candy bars. The American farmers who supervised the work details treated German prisoners with remarkable civility, often sharing water and occasionally tobacco during breaks. One farmer, an elderly man named Mr. Johnson whose son was fighting in the Pacific, had even asked Weber about his family back in Germany, listening with what seemed like genuine sympathy when Weber explained that his hometown of Dresden had been heavily bombed. Weber lies on his cot, hands behind his head, staring at the wooden ceiling. 2 cots away, Kellerman is writing a letter home, his pen scratching against paper in the quiet of early evening. Most letters never arrive, Weber knows. The chaos in Germany makes mail delivery uncertain at best. But the Americans permit unlimited correspondence, subject only to censorship to prevent intelligence leaks, and most prisoners write regularly anyway, maintaining the illusion of connection with a home that seems increasingly distant and abstract. "Did you try the corn?" Kellerman asks without looking up from his letter. "Yes." "What did you think?" Weber considers the question carefully. "It was good. Better than good. It was the kind of food you serve at celebrations, not to prisoners." Kellerman nods slowly, still writing. "I'm trying to explain it to my wife, but I don't know how without sounding like I've been brainwashed. How do I tell her that the Americans who bomb our cities also give us fresh vegetables and real butter? How do I describe the contradiction?" "Maybe it's not a contradiction," Weber says quietly. "Maybe we were wrong about what they are." Kellerman's pen stops moving. He looks up, his eyes meeting Weber's across the small distance between their cots. "If we were wrong about this, what else were we wrong about?" The question hangs in the air between them, unanswerable and terrifying in its implications. To admit error about American treatment means questioning the broader narrative, the entire ideological framework that justified 6 years of war and millions of deaths. It means considering the possibility that the 1,000-year Reich might not represent the apex of human civilization after all. Weber doesn't respond because he has no answer that doesn't lead to more dangerous questions. Instead, he rolls onto his side and closes his eyes, trying to sleep but knowing that rest will be elusive. Because tomorrow, the recreation officer will ask for volunteers to learn baseball, and Weber has already decided he will raise his hand. Not because he particularly cares about American games, but because that corn on the cob has opened a crack in his worldview, and through that crack, he can see a different possibility. The possibility that his enemies might actually be human beings worthy of respect. The possibility that strength and kindness are not mutually exclusive. The possibility that he has been, for most of his adult life, catastrophically and completely wrong about the nature of the world. Outside, the Mississippi night settles over Camp Shelby like a blanket, hot and humid and alive with the sound of crickets. In barracks across the compound, hundreds of German prisoners lie awake with similar thoughts, each one processing the cognitive dissonance between expectation and reality, between what they were told and what they've experienced. The corn on the cob was just the beginning, a small yellow cylinder that contained within its kernels the seeds of ideological revolution. Tomorrow would bring new discoveries, new contradictions, new evidence that everything they believed about their enemies might have been elaborate lies designed to keep them fighting a war that served interests far removed from their own. But tonight, Weber simply remembers the sweetness of that first bite, the butter on his fingers, the generous abundance of a nation that could afford to feed its prisoners better than Germany fed its own soldiers. And in that memory lies the beginning of transformation, slow and subtle but ultimately irresistible, like water wearing away stone one drop at a time. The transformation never announced itself with trumpets or dramatic revelations. It crept forward like dawn, imperceptible moment by moment until suddenly the world looked different than it had the night before. For Friedrich Weber, the change began with corn on the cob and accelerated through 1,000 small encounters that chipped away at certainty until nothing remained but questions. By October 1943, Camp Shelby had swollen to house over 5,000 German prisoners, the population expanding with each Allied victory in Italy and North Africa. The newer arrivals brought fresh ideology with them, minds still sharp with recent propaganda and hearts still convinced of inevitable German victory. They looked at veterans like Weber with suspicion, sensing the ideological erosion that 4 months of American captivity had produced. Weber found himself assigned to mentor duty, pairing with newly captured soldiers to help them adapt to camp life. His current charge was Underoffizier Martin Brandt, a Hitler Youth graduate turned Wehrmacht infantryman who'd been captured during the Sicily invasion. Brandt was 19 years old and absolutely certain about everything. They stood together in the evening mess line, and Weber watched Brandt's face as the young soldier received his first tray of American prison food. The corn on the cob sat there golden and steaming, an impossibility made real. Brandt stared at it with the same confusion Weber had felt months earlier. "What is this?" Brandt asked, his voice tight with suspicion. "Corn. You eat it directly off the core. Hold it at both ends and bite the kernels." Brandt's expression shifted through several emotions before settling on contempt. "Like an animal? This is meant to humiliate us, to make us behave like savages." Weber remembered thinking the same thing. He remembered the certainty that everything was a trick, a trap, a psychological operation designed to break German morale. "It's just how they eat it. Try it before you judge." But Brandt set the corn aside untouched, eating only the meat and potatoes with mechanical efficiency. "I won't participate in their degradation rituals. The Geneva Convention requires adequate nutrition, not cultural humiliation." Weber didn't argue. Arguments never changed minds, only experiences did. He ate his own corn with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd done this 100 times, savoring the sweetness that no longer seemed strange or foreign. The butter ran down his chin and he wiped it away without shame, because shame required believing this was shameful, and somewhere along the way, he'd stopped believing that. After dinner, Weber led Brandt on a tour of the recreational facilities. The camp had expanded significantly since Weber's arrival. New soccer fields, volleyball courts, even a small library stocked with German books approved by American censors. But the centerpiece was the baseball diamond, regulation size, with proper bases and a backstop constructed by prisoner labor under American supervision. A game was in progress, Germans versus Germans, though several American guards sat in makeshift bleachers watching with interest. The crack of bat against ball echoed across the compound, followed by shouting in German as a runner tried to stretch a single into a double. "They've taught you their game," Brandt observed, his tone suggesting this was evidence of corruption rather than kindness. "Some of us wanted to learn. The Americans offered instruction. And you participated? You, an Oberfeldwebel with 6 years of service?" Weber turned to face the younger man. "I participated because I was curious. Because the alternative was sitting in the barracks every evening staring at the ceiling. Because physical activity is better than idleness. Because they're trying to make you forget your German," Brandt said flatly. "This is psychological warfare. They feed us well and give us games to play so we become soft, so we forget our duty, so we stop believing in victory." The words should have stung because they contained truth. Weber had grown soft in some ways, his edges worn down by months of adequate food and humane treatment. He no longer believed in victory because victory seemed irrelevant compared to survival. And his duty now felt abstract, a loyalty oath to a government thousands of miles away that had sent him to die in African deserts and seemed surprised when he got captured instead. "Believe what you want," Weber said quietly. "But you'll be here for a long time, whether Germany wins or loses. You can spend that time angry and isolated, or you can find ways to remain human. The choice is yours." He walked away before Brandt could respond, heading toward the baseball diamond where his team was scheduled to practice. Weber had discovered unexpected aptitude for the American game, his years of military discipline translating well to the focus and precision required for batting. He'd become one of the better players in the camp league, and tonight they were preparing for a game against another barracks team. The practice session lasted 2 hours, American guards serving as umpires and offering coaching advice that Weber now understood well enough to implement. His English had improved dramatically through daily exposure and evening classes offered by the camp education officer. He could hold basic conversations, understand game instructions, even read simple newspaper articles that circulated through the compound. This linguistic adaptation troubled him more than almost anything else because it represented voluntary participation in his own cultural erosion. Every English word he learned was a small surrender, an admission that American culture had value worth engaging with. The language carried assumptions and worldviews embedded in its structure, and by learning to think in English, Weber was learning to think like Americans thought. After practice, Weber showered in the communal facilities where hot water flowed reliably and soap was distributed without rationing. He dressed in the clean clothes provided weekly by American Logistics and returned to his barracks to find Kellerman writing another letter home. "Any response from your wife?" Weber asked, settling onto his cot. Kellerman shook his head. "Mail service is increasingly unreliable. I don't know if my letters arrive or if hers fail to reach me. Either way, the silence is difficult." Weber understood. He'd stopped writing to his own family months ago after 6 letters went unanswered. The uncertainty was worse than confirmed bad news because imagination filled the void with every possible horror. Were they dead, displaced, or simply unable to correspond? The not knowing gnawed at him during quiet moments. "The Red Cross inspector is visiting tomorrow," Kellerman said, changing subjects. "There's talk they might arrange additional correspondence channels or at least provide information about conditions in Germany. The Red Cross inspections happen quarterly, neutral Swedish observers documenting camp conditions to ensure Geneva Convention compliance." Weber had participated in interviews during previous visits, and the inspectors always seemed surprised by the level of recreational programming and food quality. Their reports apparently praised American prisoner treatment, though Weber suspected those reports never reached Germany where they might contradict official propaganda. The lights dimmed at 10 o'clock, automatic timers ensuring curfew compliance without requiring guard intervention. Weber lay in darkness listening to the sounds of 5,000 men settling into sleep. Coughs and snores, whispered conversations in German, the occasional cry from someone trapped in violent dreams of combat recently escaped. He thought about Martin Brandt and the certainty that radiated from the young soldier like heat from a furnace. Weber envied that certainty even as he recognized its fragility. Brandt would go through the same process Weber had experienced, the slow accumulation of evidence that contradicted everything he'd been taught. The corn on the cob would be followed by baseball games and English lessons and conversations with American guards who turned out to be human beings rather than monsters. The transformation was inevitable because reality is persistent and propaganda eventually collapses under the weight of daily experience. You could believe Americans were barbaric savages right up until one of them shared his cigarettes and showed you pictures of his kids. You could maintain faith in German cultural superiority right up until you realized your captors possessed genuine kindness that German officers had never demonstrated toward their own men. Weber had fought this transformation for weeks, constructing elaborate explanations for why American generosity was actually psychological manipulation, why good treatment was weakness rather than strength, why everything was a trap that would eventually spring shut. But the trap never came, and eventually, the mental gymnastics required to maintain ideological purity became more exhausting than simply admitting the obvious truth. The obvious truth was that he'd been lied to. Not about everything, perhaps, but about enough critical things that the entire ideological structure became suspect. If they lied about American treatment of prisoners, what else had they lied about? If German cultural superiority was propaganda rather than fact, what did that mean for the war itself? If the 1,000-year Reich was built on falsehoods, what were 5 million German soldiers dying for? These questions had no safe answers, so Weber stopped asking them directly and instead focused on daily survival. He played baseball because it passed time. He learned English because it made life easier. He ate corn on the cob because it tasted good and refusing it wouldn't change anything. Small practical choices that added up over months to complete psychological transformation. December brought cooler weather to Mississippi, temperatures dropping into the 40s at night though never approaching the freezing winters Weber remembered from Germany. The Americans distributed additional blankets and heavier clothing, maintaining prisoner comfort with the same systematic efficiency they applied to everything else. The Christmas season approached, and camp administrators organized a celebration complete with decorations, special meals, and permission for religious services conducted by German Protestant and Catholic chaplains captured in North Africa. The Americans even provided materials for prisoners to construct a Christmas tree from pine branches and makeshift ornaments. Weber found himself on the decoration committee, working alongside Kellerman and surprisingly, Martin Brandt. The young soldier had spent his first 3 months in camp maintaining rigid ideological isolation, but even he couldn't resist the pull of community during the holidays. They worked in the recreation hall, cutting paper snowflakes and stringing them on threads borrowed from the sewing supplies. American guards supervised casually from the doorway, drinking coffee and chatting among themselves. One guard, a Sergeant Morrison whose grandfather had emigrated from Hamburg 2 generations earlier, spoke broken German and occasionally offered suggestions for the decorations. "My grandmother made snowflakes like this," Morrison said, examining their work. "She taught me when I was young. German traditions are beautiful." Brandt stiffened at the comment, clearly uncomfortable with this casual cultural exchange. But he didn't argue, didn't storm away, simply continued cutting paper in silence. Weber recognized the internal struggle because he'd experienced it himself. The cognitive dissonance between ideology and experience created psychological pressure that had to resolve somehow. The Christmas meal was extraordinary by any standard, let alone wartime prison standards. Roasted turkey, mashed potatoes, gravy, cranberry sauce, fresh bread, and for dessert, something called pumpkin pie that Weber had never encountered before. The Americans had even provided beer, watered down but genuine, allowing 1 bottle per prisoner as a holiday concession. The dining hall filled with sounds that transcended language. Laughter, conversation, the clatter of utensils against metal trays, all of it creating an atmosphere that felt more like family gathering than military prison. German prisoners sang carols they'd learned as children, voices harmonizing in the acoustically resonant hall, while American guards listened respectfully from the periphery. Weber sat with his usual group, the men who'd been captured together and had formed bonds stronger than military unit cohesion ever created. They were a family now, bound by shared captivity and mutual survival. They spoke of Christmases past, of families they might never see again, of hopes for peace that seemed increasingly fragile as the war ground on. "Do you think we'll ever go home?" Kellerman asked quietly, his beer bottle empty in his hand. No one answered immediately because honest answers were too painful. The war had turned decisively against Germany in 1943. Even the most optimistic prisoners knew that German defeat was now a question of when rather than if. And after defeat, what then? Return to a destroyed homeland? Remain in America as permanent prisoners? The future was opaque and terrifying in its uncertainty. "I think we'll survive," Weber said finally. "Whatever comes, we'll survive it. We've survived this far." It was the only certainty he could offer, and it seemed to be enough. They sat together in companionable silence, full of food and contemplating futures that remained unknowable. Around them, 5,000 German prisoners celebrated Christmas behind barbed wire in Mississippi, treated with more kindness by their enemies than their own government had ever shown them. As the evening wound down and prisoners filtered back to their barracks, Weber found himself walking past the baseball diamond one final time. The field lay empty under stars that looked the same here as they had over Germany, over Africa, over every battlefield where men died for causes that grew more abstract with distance. He thought about that first corn on the cob, the golden cylinder that had started this entire transformation. Such a small thing, just food served on a tray. But contained within those kernels had been evidence of abundance, generosity, and a fundamental assumption that even enemies deserved decent treatment. That assumption had proven more powerful than any weapon because it attacked not German military capacity but German certainty about the righteousness of their cause. Weber walked back to his barracks knowing that tomorrow would bring more of the same. More food, more baseball, more small kindnesses that accumulated into complete ideological reversal. He'd become something he never imagined possible, a German soldier who respected his American captors more than his own officers, who found their culture worth learning rather than conquering, who measured civilization not by military might but by how a nation treated those entirely at its mercy. The corn on the cob had been just the beginning, but it had been enough. One golden cylinder had contained the seeds of transformation that would eventually grow into something neither side had planned for. Enemies becoming something closer to friends. Certainty giving way to questions. And through it all, the persistent truth that human beings, regardless of uniform or nationality, share more than divides them when given the chance to discover that commonality over something as simple as a shared meal. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.